to Science 10, and we're building a matrix of 4 lectures, as we talked about last week. And this matrix of 4 lectures is an operative stepping process so that we can count instead of just lecture by lecture in some kind of cardinal way, or to change the cardinality of one by one into an ordinality by stepping up the referential orders. We can change our counting both cardinally and ordinally by grouping, so that instead of just counting by ones, we can now count by 4s, so that every 4 lectures performs the function of a single unit. So that the matrix of the 4 together, we can count this 4, the next 4, the third 4. If we count by matrices of 4, we get a radical change in the compositional possibilities. If we're just counting by ones, there's a deception that creeps in because of the structure of existence and because of the structure of the mind. But when you count by groups, there is a completely different emphasis, and the emphasis is on the set as a whole being modified by any of its constituent elements, so that the fraction, and remember that fractions are essentially ratios of proportions of the part to the whole. The modification of the set of the group by a fraction of it gives it an analytical capacity which ordinary counting doesn't have. To say it in simple words, if you're always limited to counting, you're limited to arithmetic. But if you can, quote, count by sets, then arithmetic transforms into mathematics. And while arithmetic is a very wide field, it can be explored rather completely, whereas mathematics is an infinite, boundless field. There's no limit to the analytic potential of a mathematic field. When the mind learns to educate itself to the transform threshold where it stops counting on fingers and begins to count on the way in which sets or groups morph, mathematically, the mind loses its age-old habitual inculcation by the limitations of materiality. And literally, the mind learns to become spiritual rather than material, because it recognizes that there is an intangible relationality which counts as much in the structure as do the material elements of that structure. So that you learn to count not only the elements of what is happening, but you learn to count also the relationships between those elements as aspects of the structure. So that you mature to the point to where you see that things and their relations together form a more clearer picture of what is real. And this, of course, is what an education should do at the advance that we're at now in the 21st century. In ancient times, a long time ago, more than 40,000 years ago, our kind, our species, men and women, very similar to us, almost indistinguishable except for their backgrounds, physically very much like ourselves. Their primordial relationship was to a world whose operative value lay with the animals. It was only modified in part by the plants. And the plants were not so much a nutritive factor as a medicinal factor. Gathering herbs for health purposes augmented the development of hunting for protein. And it wasn't so much that you were served a big broiled haunch of something with some vegetables that had been garnered. It was that you took herbs medicinally only when you were ill. The development of that kind of comportment towards the world, towards the animal rituals of things, became available for man's wisdom on the basis of a primordial alternation, the alternation of day and night. So that the diurnal process of day and night, the day for waking, the night for sleeping. You can't hunt very well at night. At least in ancient times, it was a very precarious thing to hunt nocturnal creatures. This whole process of the diurnal motion of life has held to the present day. We have, as one of our texts now, in this last series of 4 lectures in science, one of our texts is by a science fiction writer, Nancy Kress, and her initial novel, Beggars in Spain, is about human beings who are mutants who never sleep, who never need to sleep. They're genetically modified in the near future, about 7 years from now, 5-7 years from now. And it's noticed in the beginning of the novel, and it was a short novel published in this collection, Beaker's Dozen. Beaker as in a chemical beaker. Not a baker's dozen, but a beaker's dozen. It's not about baking bread, it's about chemical mutation of nutrition to have a different kind of staff of life. And that our kind are going to be subjected to, or at least exposed to, or given the possibility, even with emergency sirens, for modifying ourselves in ways which were not ever dreamed about before. We're going to come in such a variety of variations that the array of human beings is going to be kaleidoscopic. All of the old prejudices are old-fashioned, small-time stuff. There will be thousands of races, there will be hundreds of genders, and there will be many millions of ways quite radically different to be individual. So we are facing a kaleidoscopic future. The old education was out of date some 4,000 to 5,000 years ago already. It became a crisis about 2,500 years ago all over the world, in China, in Greece, in Egypt, in Iran, everywhere where civilization had taken hold, even in the Americas, the ancient Americas. About 2,500 years ago, the crisis was that the variant possibilities for human development visionarily had come to produce enough people who are able to engender a mathematic outlook rather than an arithmetic outlook on themselves, on others, and on life. And the difficulty about 500 BC was that those few people at the time who developed the capacity to look at life and themselves and others with an analytical exactness made them mutants at the time. They were like science fiction mutants at the time. And they had to do what Nancy Kress's characters, the sleepless, had to do. They had to make their own place of retreat. In Beggars in Spain, the place of retreat is called Sanctuary. Set in the mountains of eastern New York State, away from everyone else, the several thousand genetically mutated people who do not sleep, that they have discovered that they're also not going to age. And because they do not sleep, they can learn 24 hours a day, and because they're immortal, they can learn 24 hours a day, generation after generation, and eventually they will become de facto, through ordinary methods, super people. They will become people who physiologically not only remember their past lives, but still inhabit all those lives at the same time. Instead of being single individuals, they will have multiple lives, and they will be sets of human experience rather than arithmetic units. So that they will have an analytical capacity built into their existentiality, into their mentality, and their persons will become diffractive to the extent that they will be kaleidoscopic in and of themselves. I remember one of the more beautiful things that Joseph Campbell said on his otherwise questionable tapes on mythology. One of the beautiful things he said, modern human beings are as complicated as whole tribes of people used to be. Nancy Kress's future science fiction mutants will be as individually complicated as the entire race of mankind in themselves. Now, this is a problem that a few people have faced already in the last 2,500 years. One of the earliest examples of someone who was kaleidoscopic to the degree of inhabiting several thousand lives at the same time was the historical Buddha. Was a mutant in the sense that, as they say so proverbially and colloquially, he remembered all of his past lives. And if you read closely in the sutras, his past lives were not just several hundred years or several thousand years, they were many hundreds of thousands of years. And one of the surprisingly graphic revelations, he said, I am also not the first Buddha. That there were before me many Buddhas over tens of thousands of years into the past, and that the first Buddha, Dipankara Buddha, lived in a completely different kalpa. A kalpa in India in those times was 438,000 years. So that we are facing the fact of kaleidoscopic individuals, and it serves us well not to think of them as individuals anymore, but to think of them as kaleidoscopic persons who are like prisms of an indefinite possibility, not of daydream possibilities that they might do, but of an array almost without end of things which they do. This is an education meant to keep pace with that kind of almost infinite capacity. Now, about 200 years ago, perhaps give or take another decade, there was a writer in France, and his name was Condorcet, and he wrote while he was hiding out from the French Revolution police. He had been one of the founders of the French Revolution, which I think that you know enough of history to know that it went bad very quickly. It soured very quickly. The hope of 1789, by 1793-94, had turned into what was called, and is called historically in French history, was called the Terror. Anyone who was higher than the dirt average of those operating the guillotine were guillotined. We want absolute equality, homogenized, no one better than anyone else. Therefore, all the nobles must be killed. All of the people who consider themselves better than the citizen, sitting with all the other mob of citizens, they must be killed. And anyone who pretends that they're going to be better than all of the mob of the citizens, and well, you can see. So Condorcet was hiding out. A very courageous French woman put him up for about 9 months. She would have kept him there for years, but Condorcet became embarrassed that he was hiding behind literally the skirts of a courageous woman, and he fled the house, but having been raised as an intellectual in the urban Paris of the day, he didn't know how to fend for himself in the French countryside, and after several days of starving and cold, he went to an inn where he was immediately recognized. He was seized, he was being held to be put into prison, and he died because of his exposure. And then it was discovered that in the 9 months that he had been hiding, he wrote a book. And the book's title, for those who would like to know about such things, is called Sketch of a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. And it's one of the earliest indications that there were French children to the spirit that inhabited Benjamin Franklin as well as America. Franklin had French successors as well as American successors. He actually had English successors also. Benjamin Franklin had children in 3 countries, the United States, in England, and in France. And a couple of his French children, Condorcet, Turgot, Lafayette, were true inheritors of the Benjamin Franklin legacy because he was, like the historical Buddha, a kaleidoscopic person. He was not an individual. And one has to even take the powered intensity of an individual to include an Ayn Rand type character. He was not an individual even on compact energy of an Ayn Rand individual. But he was a kaleidoscopic differentiated person capable of integral action, but capable of also inhabiting for real any of the differential possibilities that he wished to establish. And his children, like Jefferson and Condorcet, and in England, Tom Paine, were all individuals who looked to try to develop an expanded mathematic of the rights of man, not based on counting capacities, not based on even ordinal variance of those cardinal capacities, but based on the mathematic of prismed possibilities without end. Condorcet and Paine, incidentally, served together in the French Revolution and wrote the initial essay towards a new constitution for man. Paine's Rights of Man was not just an English publication, but was influential in the United States and was operational in France for a while. Condorcet was clearly the central figure in this, Benjamin Franklin having died by 1790. And at the time that Condorcet was found to be dead because of the circumstances, it led Jefferson to severely analyze his position in the cabinet of George Washington in the United States, and he left office by understanding that nothing had changed, that the United States under the administrations of Washington was headed towards the reestablishment of an old monarchy and a privileged class of feudal warlords. And indeed, when John Adams was elected in 1796, it was apparent to Jefferson that he had to bow out of public life for the rest of his life, that the American Revolution had failed like the French Revolution had failed. Fortunately, Jefferson came back because of a vision, and by the narrowest possible margin won the election of 1800 and literally recut the United States to fit a Benjamin Franklin model. And the basis upon which he recut it was that they had put a tab on the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, is a Jefferson-inspired Madison tab placed on the Constitution so that you could tease out of the constitutional integral structure a differential spin of that structure to put it into a different configuration. Instead of it standing there monolithically as a hierarchical doctrine, it was able to be rotated by the rights, by the Bill of Rights, being able to be rotated in such a way that it achieved a different function from what a positional structure would be. The time-honored positional structure of authority is the pyramid. It's the simplest monolithic structure in the cardinal and ordinal realm of power based on might correlated to material things, and material things held and cemented together by minds that agree on the pecking order and the authority. When the Jeffersonian rotation of that pyramid happened, the top of the pyramid, instead of being just a static point, turned into an eye that radiated out light. And of course, this goes into the ancient Egyptian Hermetic tradition. The pyramids, when they were built about 2650 BC, were built on the bank of the Nile, originally down by Dashur, and finally moved up to the ridge there at Gaza, at the Giza plateau. Because that particular ridge, when the climate is right in Egypt, the Nile River West Bank has a capacity to be reflected in a mirage far inland into Egypt. And in ancient times, in times of before the Sahara Desert was desiccated, about 10,000 BC, mirages from that part of Egypt could be seen reflected off the lake, the huge lake that today is just the Qattara Depression in the Egyptian Western Desert. And those mirages from the Nile bank, from those ridges, could be seen reflected off the Qattara Lake all the way out to the oasis at Siwa, several hundred miles inland. And that's why Siwa was always the ancient place for the visionary beholding of what the Egyptian pantheon called the god Amun-Ra. When the pyramids were built, they were built with a sheen, a surface that would reflect light, so that the ancient Giza pyramids, which were higher up on the ridge, and because they had a much higher sheen, and they were much larger than the previous pyramids, even though the Katara Depression no longer had a water reflection, they could be seen mirage-like almost that far inland, and you could still see them. And it was a way of understanding differentially in a time before mathematics was really developed, that there were invisible, mysterious ways available in reality that could accommodate man's architectural creativeness, his artistic creativeness, fit into this mysterious realm of the invisible reality, and that we were welcomed to participate in the creation of the transform from the universe to the cosmos. That while the universe was a natural phenomenon, the cosmos was a supernatural phenomenon that welcomed and included our participation creatively. All of this comes down to the present day, comes down to the fact that such a thing as this actually occurs. Though it doesn't seem like much at the present moment, it's considerable and will have its effect. There is a famous poem by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, still alive in Russia. Yevtushenko, who was a brash young revolutionary poet in the 50s, and every time the Soviet government would condemn a publication by him, he was exiled back to Siberia, which fortunately for him, because he was born and raised in Siberia, just meant that he was sent home. And he was perfectly happy to go to Siberia because by that time, enough generations had lived there that they were at home. And his home, the Yevtushenko family, came from Irkutsk. Irkutsk is a city on the Angara River, not far from the Lake Baikal regions of Siberia, central Siberia. One of the most poignant things, and he was, of course, sent home for it, he wrote a long poem on the anti-Semitism of the Soviet system called Zima Junction, and he was sent home for that for a long time. And when he came back, he was so incensed over the Soviet pyramid system trying to dominate individuals who were looking at a new kind of humanity, a new kind of non-pyramidal political social order in the former place of exile in Siberia, in Irkutsk. And he wrote a long poem called Bratsk Station. Bratskaya means brotherly in Russian. Brotherly Station. At Brotherly Station, Bratsk Station, was a hydroelectric plant built just outside of Irkutsk. Now it's within the city limits because Irkutsk is a rather large city now. But Bratsk Station was a hydroelectric station built on the mighty Angara River so that the entire river was harnessed to drive the turbines, enough big turbines, to provide electricity for that whole central region of Siberia. It's the largest hydroelectric plant in Russia at the time. And because of its design, the entire natural Angara River plunged in a waterfall of several hundred feet, and the turbines were at the bottom of the plunge. And Yevtushenko, in writing Bratsk Station, contrasted in a dialogue within this large poem of the old pyramid having an argument with the hydroelectric station. that the old pyramid was built by human labor for one person, the head, the leader, the pharaoh, the dictator, whereas the hydroelectric station was built to serve everyone with heat and light. And it was a contrast of a revolutionary mathematic humanity to a hidebound, ideational, materialistic, arithmetic, linear, dead-end humanity. And in the crux of the poem, where you have Tashenko wandering in a daze, wondering what is going on in history, what is going on in his Russia, in himself, and he goes to the bottom of the station where the turbines are turning from the enormous push of the Angara River, about the size of the Colorado River. And he hears the turbines humming, and he hears that in the overlay of the sound of these turbines, he can hear a Russian word. He hears the Russian word everything. And the poem stops its dialogue, stops its argument, and for a space of about a paragraph, you just have in between dotted ellipses the word everything, 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 everything. And finally, the rest of the poem, every time he says something, there are a couple of everything, everything, everything. And you realize that he has had a supernatural trance. In the technology of the hydroelectric station, which had accepted him into its mysterious transform inner center. And that he wasn't something that he saw so much, but what he heard, because it is the hearing that precedes the seeing. In ancient wisdom, seeing was always a ordinal level above hearing, but hearing was in itself an ordinal level above touching. So at the first apprehension of certainty was that you touched, the second was that you heard, and the third was that you saw, and then there was a fourth in the transform, is that you saw through. You saw with penetration. And because you could see with penetration, you could then hear with penetration, and you could touch with penetration. So that instead of having the hand of the blind, you had the touch of the lover. And when you touched nature with the hand of the lover, nature woke in response to your capacity and loved you back. And instead of just being there as a material thing to be touched by someone blind, it was there to be enthralled in the dance of love, in the hearing of the ear, as it says in the book of Job, the teacher of righteousness writing that about 160 BC. And even then, one could see in the book of Job, it says, I have heard with the hearing of the ear, and now my eye sees thee. That the eye sees not just unity, but sees through unity to its mysterious contextual origin, an origin that is not a thing in itself, but is a ground without bound, out of which unity emerges whole. This was called rebirth. That rebirth occurs whole. It doesn't occur in parts. And that as long as one's sense of transform is incomplete, one gets little bits of insight instead of vision. And the little bits of insight are like fragments that are factored back in an arithmetical way and become things in themselves, so that one speaks glibly and rather stupidly of having an insight. as if there is such a thing as an insight, as if you can take a fragment of divinity and make it just some kind of separated spark. The old Hasidic thing of gathering the sparks of insight to bring the fire of God back into its unity is a way of saying, don't get into that game playing of trying to make a pastiche of bits of insight. Stand for wisdom. Wisdom is not representational at all, but is always presentational, and its presentation is always whole. And what it presents is not only itself, but its context of emergence. In the Chinese way, Tao and Te always operate together in a complementarity. And that's why Te has its own complementarity from that archetype, not an archetype of a form, but archetypally of form and no form together, so that Te has its complementarity, which is yin and yang. You can see that rapidly it becomes deep water. That if one tries to approach it in a portioned out way, you will never get there. You fall into a logical conundrum typified in ancient Greece by a thinker from a little town, Elea. So the Eleatic philosophers were always trying to caution people, watch out for these pitfalls of thought. And one of them was the saying that if there's a race between a rabbit and a tortoise, and the rabbit can only go halfway very quickly, eventually the tortoise will win the race. Because the rabbit, though it's much faster than a tortoise, if it can only go halfway, it gets caught into a conundrum where it can never finish the race ever. It only goes smaller and smaller increments of halfway, and eventually the tortoise will win. Parmenides and Zeno of Elea were famous in classical Greek antiquity for bringing these qualities into play. They are meant to show that you cannot get to wholeness partially. That wholeness emerges fresh each and every time. And when it emerges fresh, it emerges in such a way that its unity is also a complementarity. So that unity, any one that is really one, can also be logically considered not only just one, but one over one. Can be written in a different way. And one can work with these rephrasings of actuality not as if they were equivalents, but with the basic fact that they function the same. And so unity has a very curious kind of a nature to it. And unity, oneness, always pairs itself with zero. Always. It never not occurs without zero being paired with it. So that the universe cannot exist without the void, without the non-bounded, non-countable void. And this is a very deep problem, especially for thinkers like Descartes, who thought the universe is a plenum, and that action must, because it's full all the time, must go through that fullness by contact, by a geometry of actual causal contact. And all of this is a rather severe problem, and two of the things that cannot be countenanced in that are zero and infinity, voids and infinities. And of course, for scholastic philosophy in the West, voids and infinities were subjects that one shouldn't talk about. Even today, a kind of a nouveau scholast like Stephen Hawking still talks about things within the parentheses, don't talk about zeros and infinities. And a lot of limitations in physics today, though they're very sophisticated limitations, they're limitations because one needs to be able to go into boundlessness without losing a hitch, not in counting, nor in ordinality, but in reality, which is a whole different thing. It involves wisdom. So an education like this is performing an age-old, tried and true function, but in a completely different way. We're not trying to achieve individuality. We are achieving a re-emergence into a whole, which allows us to explore everything, 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 without fear. Let's take a break and we'll come back. So there's always a pair, and that pairedness is a complementarity. When you go out into nature on a vision quest, and you think that you're going to the top of the mountain, you believe that all the time until you arrive at the top of the mountain. And when you do, if you've been keeping a yogic, arithmetical track of what you are doing in your questing and you get to the top of the mountain, what do you do then? Because there's no more mountain to devour in any other step. You're there at the top. And it is only there, usually, that men realized that it wasn't about getting to the top of the mountain, but it was about being accepted by the mountain range. It was about it being accepted by nature. And that men only learn that by being taken doggedly, arithmetical step by arithmetical step, until they have done all the steps, and there are no more steps to be done, and it doesn't help them to have the compulsion to keep on taking those steps, because there are no more steps to be taken. So when you have come to the last step, the male psyche has a puzzlement and a balking exactly there. And only by not knowing what else to do at that moment do they experience acceptance. Because acceptance is not an action at all. It's a context that absorbs all action. So that at that point, a threshold comes into play, which is not masculine at all, but is feminine. The beginning of acceptance through the saturation of the arithmetical leads to a transform to the mathematical. So that in ancient wisdom, there was always the sense that natural landscapes of maturation led to a moment where there were no more steps to be taken, only the acceptance and its concomitant absorption. Absorption. And that absorption was physiologically, usually, an ecstasy, or for those who couldn't accept, it was a terror. And for those who were conscious that the ecstasy and the terror together were the same event, and it led to a transcendental wisdom, a moment. So that the ancient architecture of sacred space was always a selective conformation of the landforms to allow for that threshold to be arrived at, where the terror, the ecstasy, and the wisdom, all three transforms were at the same place at the same time. And one of the great examples of this, about midway in the architecture of the sacred, is in the far back reaches of the cave at Lascaux, about 20,000 years ago. It's about midway in time of the 40,000 years of Paleolithic art to the present, and Lascaux is like a Paleolithic cathedral of initiation to the threshold of acceptance and absorption, where ecstasy, terror, and wisdom are all present at the very same time. And at the very back, at the end of the Lascaux cave, the opening up of the landscape of nature to the vulva-like penetration of the earth through the morphing of the Lascaux cavern rooms and corridors and passages to the very end, and at the very end was a drop-off. It was a chimney-like plunge of quite a distance. 45 feet doesn't sound like much, but when you're underground that far in Paleolithic times, with just little torch smudges, actually they were hand-held little pots of animal fat that had been refined, and there was quite a plunge. And it wasn't that you just came and looked like a tourist, but that actually you were pushed over and you fell. And as you fell, you experienced all three responses at the same time: ecstasy, terror, and wisdom. You didn't die because you were held by a Paleolithic rope, by three braids of animal fiber that were braided and held you so that it was like a bungee cord. Only you didn't bounce, you just hit that dead end a few feet from the bottom, where you would have indeed died in an abysmal darkness as far as you knew you were falling forever. It wasn't discovered until about 2 generations after Lascaux was found that bits of that Paleolithic rope were found charred at the bottom of that pit. No one had ever looked down there, had gone there, and there it was. And it began to make clear why it was that the petroglyph on the wall facing the individual who was about to go over that plunge was the stick figure of a man with a bird's head and his penis erect, out of ecstasy, terror, and transcendental turning into a winged bird all at the same time. That level of acceptance into nature as an initiation was necessary already 20,000 years ago, because the complications of Paleolithic civilization, though there were not cities, there was Paleolithic civilization, and the complications after at least 20,000 years of that, and 100,000 years of being in the species Homo sapiens, and the millions of years of being hominid and the tens of millions of years of being primate, and on, that all of those layers had produced such a complexity that at the time of making Lascaux, it was necessary to be that dramatic to get through the layers of obfuscation. We live in a time where the layers of obfuscation are so complex that it's almost impossible to get through. The density of ignorance is literally sky high, and one has to go beyond the sky to get it now. And the first human being to ever go beyond the sky and get it was a man, actually an American, and he was a fighter pilot. His name was Ed White. And Ed White is one of the most courageous human beings probably ever to trod the earth. He was the first person to do a spacewalk. And he did a spacewalk not out of some comfortable shuttle, but out of one of the Gemini capsules. All he had was one other fighter jock in there with him, way up nowhere. And his assignment was to go outside the Gemini capsule and make a little test of some of the equipment and then to come back in. Only when he went out, he didn't come back in. And the transcript was heavily edited. NASA made sure that it was overlaid with censorship. And it was only through the good services of Jim McDivitt that it was finally made available through his recollections of actually what happened. He said it wasn't that White lost his head out there, but that he was so happy he refused to come in. And his actual words were, "It's not empty out here. It's friendly. It's a velvet, deep, beautiful. It's not a darkness of terror, but that the universe welcomes us in the most gentle, pervasive, penetrating way." And when he looked down, he saw that the life support systems were an umbilical cord that went back to the Gemini capsule. And because in those early days of the program, this is pre-Apollo, the umbilical cord was coated in pure gold, 24-karat gold. And so he had been born out of a Gemini capsule by an umbilical of pure gold, and he was busy trying to undo it so he could just stay out there, because it wasn't a death thing. It was that he had been reborn and knew it. And the repeated attempts of NASA to bring him back to the Earth medical program of the mission were nonsense to him. Unfortunately, Jim White died in the flash fire in Apollo 1, along with Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee. I remember writing a mystical poem about that at the time, and it seemed to me the most peculiar thing that at the beginning of Apollo, the first man to be reborn into space should have been consumed by the first Apollo, the fire of the first Apollo, because it reminded me of the ancient tradition. The ancient tradition was that Apollo, as the god of, Homer says, Apollo is far-darting, far-seeing, that his eyes see afar, which means that he has the ability to see penetratively. Apollo is the god whose chariot is the sun, and he sees all of what is there to be seen. But he was challenged in Greek mythology by a young, new god who was not a part of the original pantheon, not a part of the original mythology, a new god who was born and who was young, and that new god was Hermes. And when Hermes was born, the first thing he did was to steal the oxen of Apollo. He was a cattle rustler. First Hermetic act in Greek mythological history is that he came out and he stole the cattle of the sun. Now, if you know Homer's Odyssey, you know that stealing the cattle of Helios is a crime punishable by mythological death forever. Only Hermes wasn't punished because he made his peace with Apollo. He said, I did it because I wanted to show you that they were stealable and that you're not the big rancher in the sky that you thought you were, because this universe now includes something beyond all of your ability to see everything in daylight, the eternal daylight of the sun. There is such a thing as the invisible realms of transform, which I happen to be the divine bringer of. And so Hermes was the god of the invisible realms that Apollo cannot see. No matter how glorious he is, he cannot see the invisible realms. And as we know now, visible light is such a small little wedge of the electromagnetic spectrum as to be almost undialable when you have equipment that has the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It's very difficult to dial visible light. The energy level at which the electromagnetic spectrum is visible is so small that the best instrument to detect it is the human eye. And that the human eye, when it's really trained, sees in visible light almost as good as any equipment can possibly be designed to see. So that advanced computer technology in the 2030s will be trying to work with the model of the human eye seeing for the visual presentations of pixels for computers, for holographic screens of the day. Because our eyes are the best that evolution can do to see as we see in visible light. Yes, that's true, that insects like flies see hundreds of images at the same time, but they're all the same thing. You don't need hundreds of images. But what you do need is color vision, because you can't very well digest green apples, and you can only tell if they're ripe if they're red. And so color vision was given to our kind before we were hominids. Even the monkeys, the early primates of 70 million years ago already had color vision, which separated them from all the other animals in creation, gave them that. They can see when something is ripe. And so we can see when something is ripe, even to that arcane threshold of where ecstasy, terror, and deep wisdom come together. At that threshold of being accepted by Mother Nature to the point to where she no longer, the word rebirth is unfortunate because it's a connotation of being mothered again. Actually, the ancient understanding in the Hermetic tradition, when it was really refined, was that Mother Nature is no longer Mother Nature, but is a lover. That it is love and not birthing that happens there. That the refinement, the distillation of the transform is that love then is an operative form of the way in which energy works in the cosmos. The love is an energy. And that it doesn't dial in and focus in any particular registry, but that it goes the entire context, not only of the electromagnetic spectrum, but of the very high-powered magnetoelectric spectrum as well. Takes them all in. The magnetoelectric spectrum at about 10 billion times the intensity dwarfs the electromagnetic spectrum. It's almost insignificant. That we are able to be accepted on scales of seen and unseen together, grouped together, gives us not only the opportunity, but puts upon us the responsibility to own up to the real. We're already there. It does no good to think that it's not there. It's been there for quite some time. Even 20,000 years ago already, there was a realization that one needs to come to the realization of being accepted, not only by nature completely, but by the supernatural complement to nature as well. And that acceptance is what the architecture of the sacred is all about. And that the way in which that is initially prepared is to make an entrance available at the very point of saturation. So that in terms of full circle, you never close the circle, but you leave the last point that would close the circle slightly off kilter so that it doesn't close as a circle but continues as a spiral. So that when that journeying comes to a completeness, instead of being complete, it transforms. And the transform carries it on so that there is further iterations of completeness through time, which makes the spiral a helix. And that this occurs not only visually, but invisibly. So it's a double helix. And that double helix is a braidedness, which accepts a third helical structure, and that is consciousness. So that there is such a thing as a triple helical structure, where it is not only life, like in a double helix, but is conscious life, as in a triple helix. One of the earliest understanders of this, though he couldn't quite express it, was Linus Pauling. And Linus Pauling saw that there should be room in a quantum chemistry for a triple helical structure to make sense out of the complexity which is there. It wasn't that he didn't see the double helix before Watson and Crick, but that he chose, because he understood quantum chemistry much better than Watson and Crick at the time. They were just young professors. Pauling at the time, in the early 1950s, already had about 20 years of quantum chemistry. He wrote the book under his belt. First edition of quantum chemistry by Pauling is in the mid-1930s. He saw that in his own joyful, ebullient way, that there is definitely a sense of structure that seems to pervade transformed naturalness in a triplicate mode. And indeed, it does. But as far as life is concerned, the double helix makes the physiological structure. It carries the genetic quality. It makes the chromosomal matrices able to operate in such a refined way that there are just less than 1% of a difference in the DNA between ourselves and some of the closest primates to us. And yet, the difference in that small percent is almost astronomical. In fact, would be, I think, better characterized as astrophysical. And so too, in our kind, the slightest differential expansion makes an enormous difference. So there is such a thing as different people, different capacities. In Nancy Kress's Beggars in Spain, she says, oh yes, all men are born equal under the law. But the capacities of people are quite different. And she teases out in her novel how adding one genetic difference, not needing sleep, distributes itself throughout the entire psychophysical structure of the people, and the sleepless are discovered to be immortal. They not only need sleep, but that their bodies repair themselves in such a way that the telomeres never shrink. And there is not only no sleep, but there's no aging, and so they become available more and more as the information comes out to be the horrific Frankensteins to some people, the tremendous puzzle of joy to some people, and the transcendental harbinging of a whole new echelon of human evolution to other people. All these at the same time in a complex overlay, and she develops this theme wonderfully, beautifully. And we're pairing that with Kip Thorne's Black Holes and Time Warps. The whole thing about black holes is the singularity. The whole thing about time warps is the infinity. The one and the many, but the many as in many without end, and the one as one without compare. They call in classical Judaism, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. That kind of a unity, and yet in Hellenistic Judaism, the penetrating triple wisdom was that there is a perceivable penetration through the one to something more fundamental, more, Philo says, more primordial than the one, better than the good. And that this is indeed the unnamed boundlessness that allows for the emergence of life in the first place. And that that can only be approached through a saturation of our efforts leading to a cessation of any further efforts and a threshold of acceptance. And that this is called wisdom instead of knowing. One doesn't become differential through knowing, but through the transforms of acceptance and absorption and emergence. And that these are indeed quite different. So that Science 8's title was Helical Arcs, Not Old Angles. The models of geometricity for our mind produced box canyons that were not apparent to many people throughout history, especially the last 2,500 years. And to those to whom it was apparent, their only way to comport to that apparent limitation was to go into various modes of what has been called traditionally mysticism, or transcendental experience, or otherworldliness. And all of this is a rather abject reduction and labeling from the standpoint of the limitation. The mysteriousness is in nature, not in us. It's simply in our being accepted by that mysteriousness. That makes us mysterious. So that the form of the person is really a mysterious person. I once used to use that, as a matter of fact, as the style for it, that the artist is a mysterious person. They can create forms that, if we approach them in the right way, accept us. And that the appreciator is different from somebody who's just looking at the art, becomes absorbed by the work of art to the point in that absorption that an acceptance occurs. As Virginia Woolf in To the Lighthouse said, there are moments of eternity in time, and a work of art makes those thresholds available. That's the creativeness of it. And that getting accepted and absorbed and used to being free in that way makes us affine with the cosmos. That we find that it isn't just this work of art, but the entire cosmos operates as the largest work of art available. and accepts us in the same way, absorbs us in the same way, like Ed White, all of a sudden realizing that stepping out 100-some miles above the earth, that he wasn't stepping out into a terrifying dizziness, but into a velvet beauty that he didn't want to leave. They had a curious sequence of photos that they released before the censorship came. And when Ed White clearly in one of the photos saw the symbol of the golden umbilical cord coiling back to his vehicle, and he realized that he had been born out again. In the next sequence, he turned over his shoulder and saw the earth. And Ed White was the first human being to raise his hand, and his hand was larger than the earth. More next week.